The candles in the great hall flickered as Duke Edmund Ashworth's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I want her gone," he said, loud enough for every servant standing near the staircase to hear. He did not look at his wife when he said it. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone at the bottom of the stairs, her hands trembling at her sides. For a moment, no one moved. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, lowered her eyes. A young footman near the door pretended to study the floor. Clara felt every gaze on her skin, even the ones that tried not to look. She had been married to Edmund for 2 years, and in all that time, she had never heard him speak with such open contempt, not even in their worst arguments, not even on the night her father had died and Edmund had refused to attend the funeral. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind her, she heard the low murmur of servants beginning to whisper. By tomorrow, the story would reach the kitchens, the stables, and probably the village beyond the estate gates. Duchesses were not supposed to be humiliated in front of staff. Dukes were not supposed to say such things about the women they had vowed to protect. Clara reached her chamber and shut the door softly behind her. She did not cry, though her throat ached with the effort of holding it back. She sat at the edge of her bed and stared at the cold fireplace, where no fire had been lit that evening because she had told the maid not to bother, thinking she would not be staying in the room long enough to need it. She had not told anyone that, not yet. For weeks, Clara had felt the walls of Ashworth Manor closing in around her. It was not the house itself, with its long marble corridors and towering windows that let in more shadow than light. It was the way Edmund looked through her, as though she were a piece of furniture inherited from his father, useful only because it had always been there. She had tried, in the beginning, to be the wife he wanted. She had learned the names of every tenant on his land. She had organized dinners for men whose opinions she found dull and whose wives barely spoke to her. She had waited, patient and hopeful, for some sign that he saw her as more than an arrangement made between 2 families years before either of them had a say in the matter. That sign had never come. Instead, there had been silence at breakfast, and long absences during which Edmund rode out to inspect his properties without a word of where he was going or when he might return. There had been evenings when he sat across from her at dinner and spoke only to the servants, never to her, as if she were invisible in her own home. Clara had swallowed her pride again and again, telling herself that duty came before feeling, that a marriage built on family alliance did not need warmth to survive. Tonight had proven her wrong. She rose from the bed and walked to the window. Below, the garden stretched out in darkness, the hedges trimmed into perfect shapes that meant nothing to her. She thought of her mother, who had died when Clara was 12, and who used to say that a woman's worth was never decided by another person's cruelty. Clara had carried those words with her through every difficult year since, but tonight, for the first time, she wondered if she had been foolish to keep believing them while staying in a house where she was so plainly unwanted. A soft knock came at the door. It was Margaret, her lady's maid, the only person in the house who had never treated Clara as though she were merely passing through someone else's life. "Your Grace," Margaret said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I heard what happened in the hall." Clara did not turn from the window. "Everyone has heard by now, I imagine." Margaret hesitated, twisting her hands together. She had served Clara since the day of her wedding, and in that time she had grown fiercely loyal, though she rarely said so aloud. It was not right what he said. Not right at all. "No," Clara agreed. "It wasn't." She turned then, and Margaret saw something in her mistress's eyes that had not been there before. Not sadness, though sadness lingered underneath. Something sharper, something that looked almost like resolve. "Margaret," Clara said, "I need your help with something, and I need you to promise me you will not speak of it to anyone." Margaret's brow furrowed, but she nodded without hesitation. "You know I would never betray your trust, Your Grace." Clara crossed the room and knelt beside the small trunk she kept at the foot of her bed, the one that had traveled with her from her father's house when she first came to Ashworth Manor as a bride. She opened it and began quietly sorting through what little she owned that was truly hers. Jewelry from her mother, a handful of letters, a warm cloak that did not carry the Ashworth crest embroidered into its lining. "You are leaving," Margaret whispered, understanding dawning on her face. "I have thought of nothing else since the moment those words left his mouth," Clara said. "I have given this marriage everything I had to give. I have nothing left to prove, and clearly nothing left to offer that he wants." "But where would you go? A duchess cannot simply vanish. People will search for you. His pride alone will demand it." Clara managed a faint, humorless smile. "Then I will not leave as a duchess. I will leave as no one at all." Margaret's hands stilled. "You cannot mean that." "I do," Clara said, and there was no wavering in her voice now. I have spent 2 years disappearing a little more each day inside these walls, becoming smaller and quieter, until I hardly recognized my own reflection. If I am going to disappear, Margaret, I would rather do it on my own terms, somewhere he cannot reach me, than continue fading away in a house where my presence is treated as an inconvenience. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Somewhere below, a door closed, footsteps echoing down a corridor. Clara flinched instinctively, though she knew it was likely only a servant finishing the evening's work. I will need your help getting past the east gate before dawn, Clara continued. I know the stable boy who tends the horses at that hour trusts you. If you could arrange for a horse to be ready, and tell no one why, I could be far from here before anyone realizes I am gone. Margaret's eyes filled with worry, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of admiration for the quiet courage her mistress was showing. And if his grace comes looking for you, if he demands I tell him where you've gone, then tell him the truth, Clara said. Tell him you do not know, because once I leave tonight, Margaret, I intend to make certain that no one does. She spent the next hour packing only what she could carry easily, discarding the fine gowns that marked her as a duchess, and choosing instead simple, practical clothing she had kept hidden away since her arrival, remnants of the life she had lived before her marriage. She took a small amount of coin she had saved quietly over the months, money Edmund had never known existed because he had never thought to ask what she did with her days. As the house grew silent around midnight, Clara sat by her window and watched the moon climb higher above the hedges. She thought of the girl she had been before this marriage, hopeful and unafraid, and wondered when exactly that girl had begun to disappear. She thought of Edmund's voice in the hall, cold and final, and felt something inside her harden into certainty. Whatever waited for her beyond the gates of Ashworth Manor, it could not be worse than staying in a place where she was told, in front of an entire household, that she was wanted gone. Margaret returned just before 2 in the morning, her face pale with nerves but her resolve steady. The horse is ready, she whispered. The stable boy believes I need it for an errand at first light. He will say nothing. Clara embraced her tightly, longer than she had embraced anyone in years. Thank you, she said, for everything. Be safe, Margaret whispered back, tears gathering in her eyes. Wherever you go, be safe. Clara slipped out through the servants' passage, her cloak pulled tight around her, her small bag of belongings clutched against her chest. The corridors were dark and empty, the household finally at rest after the tension of the evening. She passed Edmund's study, where a single candle still burned low, and paused for the briefest moment, wondering if he sat inside even now, indifferent to what his words had set into motion. She did not knock, she did not look back. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. The horse waited exactly where Margaret had promised, saddled and calm, its breath rising in soft clouds. Clara mounted quickly, gripping the reins with hands that no longer trembled. She rode away from Ashworth Manor as the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, leaving behind the title, the estate, and the man who had wanted her gone. By the time the household woke and discovered her room empty, her bed untouched, her belongings vanished as though she had never existed at all, Clara would be miles away, already becoming someone else entirely. The road ahead stretched pale and empty under the fading stars, bordered by tall trees that seemed to lean inward, as if watching her pass. Clara kept the horse at a steady pace, not fast enough to draw attention should any early traveler cross her path, but not so slow that she risked being caught before the sun rose fully over the hills. Every sound made her heart quicken, the snap of a branch, the distant call of an owl, the soft thud of her horse's hooves against packed earth. She had never traveled alone before, not once in her entire life, and the strangeness of it pressed against her chest like a hand she could not push away. Yet beneath the fear, something else was growing, small and stubborn, refusing to be smothered. It was the feeling of choosing her own path for the first time since she could remember. Every decision that had shaped her life until this night had been made by someone else, her father who arranged her marriage to settle a debt of loyalty between two old families, her husband who decided how she should dress, whom she should speak with, what opinions were acceptable to hold in his presence. Even her sorrow, she realized, had often been shaped by what others expected her grief to look like. Now, riding through the darkness toward a future she could not yet see, Clara belonged to no one but herself. She thought of the servants who would wake in a few hours to find her chamber empty, the bed still made from the night before, her jewelry box left behind because none of it had ever truly felt like hers. She wondered how long it would take before someone noticed, before Mrs. Whitfield knocked gently on her door only to find silence, before word reached Edmund that his wife was nowhere to be found. Would he feel anything at all, she wondered, or would relief settle over him the moment he understood his wish had somehow been granted? The thought should have hurt more than it did. Instead, Clara found a strange comfort in it. If he wanted her gone, then gone she would be, completely and without a trace, leaving him to answer for his own words in whatever way his conscience demanded, if it demanded anything at all. By the time the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the fields in soft gold, Clara had left the borders of Ashworth Land far behind. She did not know the name of the town ahead, only that it lay far enough from everything familiar that no one there would recognize the face of a runaway duchess. She slowed her horse at a quiet crossroads and looked back once, toward the direction of the manor now hidden behind rolling hills. Then she turned forward, toward a horizon she could not yet name, and continued on. Mrs. Whitfield's knuckles rapped against the bedroom door 3 times before worry crept into her chest. It was well past the hour when the Duchess usually rose, and the silence behind the door felt wrong in a way she could not quite name. She knocked again, calling softly, then louder, and when no answer came, she pressed the handle down and stepped inside. The bed was untouched. The window stood slightly open, curtains stirring in the morning breeze. The jewelry box sat closed on the dressing table, but when Mrs. Whitfield lifted the lid, she found only a few plain pieces left behind, nothing of real value, nothing that spoke of someone planning to return soon. Her breath caught. She hurried to the wardrobe and found gowns still hanging in careful rows, silk and lace untouched, while a small gap on the shelf below told her that a traveling cloak and a modest bag were missing. Whoever had left this room had not been taken. She had chosen to go. Mrs. Whitfield stood frozen for a long moment, torn between duty and dread, before finally turning and hurrying down the corridor toward the Duke's study. Edmund sat behind his desk, a stack of correspondence untouched before him, his expression unreadable as it so often was. He looked up when the housekeeper entered without knocking, an act so unusual from a woman who valued propriety above almost everything else, that he knew immediately something was wrong. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice trembling slightly. "The Duchess is not in her chamber. Her bed has not been slept in. Some of her belongings are missing." For a moment, Edmund simply stared at her, as though the words had not fully reached him. Then he stood so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean exactly that, Your Grace. Her traveling cloak is gone. A bag as well. And there is no sign of her anywhere in the house." Edmund moved past her without another word, striding down the hall toward Clara's chamber with a speed that startled the servants he passed. He threw open the door and stood in the doorway, taking in the same details Mrs. Whitfield had already discovered: the untouched bed, the open window, the careful absence of anything that suggested a hurried, panicked flight. This had been planned. He searched the room himself, opening drawers, checking beneath the bed, though he could not have said what he expected to find. A note, perhaps, some explanation, some proof that this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a stern word and a quick return to order. He found nothing. Clara had left no trace of where she had gone or why, though the why, if he was honest with himself in that unguarded moment, was not truly a mystery at all. He remembered his own voice in the hall the night before. He remembered the words leaving his mouth before he had fully considered their weight, spoken in a moment of frustration after a difficult letter from his creditors, aimed at Clara simply because she happened to be standing nearby when his temper reached its peak. He had not meant for the entire household to hear. He had told himself, as he walked away from her afterward, that he would apologize eventually, once his mood settled, once he found the right words. He had not expected there would be no one left to apologize to. "Search the grounds," he ordered, straightening his shoulders as though sheer authority alone could undo what had happened. "Question every servant. Someone must have seen something, heard something. She could not have vanished into thin air." The household staff were questioned one by one throughout the morning, but most had nothing to offer beyond confirming what everyone already suspected: that the Duchess had seemed unusually quiet the previous evening, that she had retired early, that no unusual visitors had come or gone. Only Margaret remained composed under questioning, her answers careful and measured, revealing nothing of the promise she had made or the horse she had arranged in the dead of night. "I saw nothing unusual, Your Grace," she said, meeting Edmund's eyes without flinching. "Her Grace bid me good night as she always does, and I left her to rest." Edmund studied her closely, some instinct telling him the maid knew more than she admitted, but he had no proof, and pressing further would only draw more attention to a situation he desperately wanted contained. Word of a duchess who had vanished after her own husband declared he wanted her gone would spread through society like fire through dry grass, and Edmund's pride recoiled at the thought of what people would say, how they would look at him, how quickly sympathy for Clara would turn into scandal for his family name. By midday, riders had been sent along every road leading away from the estate, instructed to ask after a young woman traveling alone, though Edmund realized with growing unease that he could not say for certain what Clara might be wearing, what name she might be using, or even which direction she had chosen. She had planned this carefully, and the realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor, arrived at the manor by afternoon, summoned by an urgent message, and clearly displeased at having to make the journey. She found her son pacing the length of his study, his composure fraying at the edges in a way she had rarely witnessed. "Tell me what happened," Eleanor said, settling into a chair with the calm authority of a woman who had weathered every kind of family crisis before. "And tell me honestly, Edmund, I have no patience for half-truths today." Edmund recounted the previous evening reluctantly, omitting nothing, though the words tasted bitter as he spoke them aloud. His mother listened in silence, her expression growing colder with every detail. "You said that, in front of the staff, in front of everyone. I did not think." "No," Eleanor cut in sharply. "You did not think. You never do, when your temper takes hold of you. Do you have any idea what that girl has endured since coming into this family? She arrived here a bride of 17, torn from everything familiar, and she has spent every day since trying to earn affection from a man too consumed by his own bitterness to notice the effort." Edmund's jaw tightened. "This is not the time for a lecture, Mother. My wife is missing." "Your wife left," Eleanor corrected coldly. "There is a difference, and you would do well to understand it before you continue this search. A woman does not vanish without a trace, unless she has been planning her escape for some time. Clara did not simply flee in a moment of hurt feeling. She chose this." Her words settled over Edmund like a weight he could not shake. He thought back over the recent months, searching for signs he might have missed, moments when Clara had seemed distant, withdrawn, quietly retreating from a marriage that offered her little warmth in return. He remembered evenings when she sat across from him at dinner, attempting conversation that he answered with clipped, distracted replies. He remembered her asking, gently, whether he might join her for a walk through the gardens, and how he had waved the invitation away, citing business that, in truth, could easily have waited. He had not seen her, not truly, not in longer than he cared to admit. "Where would she have gone?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to his mother. "She has no family left, no close friends beyond the estate." "Perhaps that is precisely why she left," Eleanor said. "A woman with nothing tying her to a place has nothing holding her back from leaving it, especially when what awaits her there is a husband who wishes her gone." The words struck harder than Edmund expected, and for the first time since the previous night, something close to genuine fear settled into his chest, sharper and more unsettling than mere concern for appearances. What if she came to harm out there, alone, with no protection and no name to call her own? What if the search parties found nothing, not because Clara had hidden herself skillfully, but because something worse had happened on the road? He pushed the thought away, unwilling to let it take root, and turned back to the maps spread across his desk, tracing the roads leading away from the estate with a finger that trembled slightly despite his effort to appear composed. As evening fell and the search parties returned one by one with nothing to report, Edmund stood alone at his window, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere beyond those darkening hills, his wife was building a life without him, and for the first time, he began to understand that finding her again would require far more than simply commanding it to be so. The letters came the next morning, delivered by a servant who had gone searching through Clara's old writing desk at Eleanor's insistence. They were letters Clara had written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular, filled with quiet reflections on her loneliness within the marriage. Edmund read them alone in his study, each line landing like a small blow, revealing a woman who had hoped, again and again, for some sign of warmth that never came. One line, near the bottom of the final letter, remained with him longer than the rest. She had written that she feared becoming a ghost in her own home, present in body, but invisible in every way that mattered. Edmund set the letter down and pressed his hands against his eyes, the full weight of what his cruelty had cost finally beginning to settle over him. Word of the missing Duchess did not stay contained within the walls of Ashworth Manor for long, no matter how carefully Edmund tried to control it. A traveling merchant who had stopped at the estate for trade mentioned, in passing conversation at a roadside inn 2 days later, that the Duke's household seemed unusually tense, that servants spoke in hushed voices, that no one seemed willing to say where the lady of the house had gone. By the time the tale reached the ears of Lord Gareth Winslow, a neighboring landowner who had long resented the Ashworth family's influence over local trade routes, it had already grown into something far more scandalous than the truth. Gareth received the news with quiet satisfaction. He had spent years watching Edmund inherit privilege after privilege, land and title handed to him simply by birth, while Gareth's own family had clawed their way into respectability through decades of careful maneuvering. Any crack in the Ashworth reputation was an opportunity, and a vanished duchess, potentially fled from cruelty or worse, was exactly the kind of crack that could be widened into something useful. He said nothing publicly, not yet. Instead, he began quietly gathering information, sending a trusted steward to make discreet inquiries in nearby towns, watching for any sign of where the missing woman might have gone. If he could locate her before Edmund did, or better still, ensure that the full truth of the Duke's cruelty reached the right ears in society, he would have leverage that no amount of land or title could easily undo. Back at the manor, Edmund remained unaware of the quiet maneuvering taking shape beyond his walls, too consumed by his own guilt and mounting desperation to notice the danger gathering at the edges of his family's reputation. He sent riders farther afield each day, expanding the search beyond the immediate roads to neighboring villages and market towns, though every report returned the same disappointing answer. No one had seen a woman matching Clara's description. No one recalled selling a horse or offering lodging to a traveler traveling alone. It was as though she truly had vanished into nothing. Margaret, meanwhile, carried the weight of her secret with a heaviness that pressed on her every waking hour. She had promised Clara silence, and she intended to keep that promise. But watching the household unravel in worry, and watching Edmund's guilt visibly deepen with each passing day, made the burden of what she knew almost unbearable. More than once, she caught herself nearly speaking, the truth rising to her lips before she forced it back down. One evening, Eleanor found her alone in the servants' hall, staring blankly at a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. "You know something?" Eleanor said quietly, taking the seat across from her without invitation. It was not a question. Margaret's hands tightened around the cup. "I do not know where she has gone, Your Grace. That much is true. But you know she planned to leave." Margaret hesitated, torn between loyalty to the woman who had trusted her, and respect for the Dowager Duchess, who had always treated the staff with more kindness than her son managed. Finally, she spoke carefully, choosing each word. "I know that she was unhappy longer than anyone in this house cared to notice. I know that whatever she has done, she did not do it carelessly. And I believe, Your Grace, that wherever she has gone there because she finally found the courage to choose herself over a marriage that gave her nothing in return." Eleanor studied the young maid for a long moment, something like respect flickering across her features. "You care for her a great deal." "She was kind to me when she had no reason to be," Margaret said simply, in a house where kindness seemed in short supply. Eleanor said nothing more, but she did not press Margaret further, and in the days that followed, she found herself watching her son with a mixture of frustration and reluctant sympathy, waiting to see whether the man she had raised still had it in him to become someone worth Clara's return, should she ever be found at all. As the first week without Clara drew to a close, Edmund received an unsigned letter delivered by an unfamiliar courier, its message brief and unsettling. It suggested, in careful and deliberately vague language, that certain parties were aware of the circumstances surrounding his wife's disappearance, and that such knowledge, if shared widely, might prove costly to a family already burdened by whispered rumors of cruelty within its walls. Edmund read the letter twice, his hands tightening around the paper until it creased. He did not recognize the hand that had written it, but the implication was clear enough. Someone was watching. Someone intended to use Clara's disappearance and his own careless words as a weapon against him. He burned the letter in the fireplace of his study that night, watching the paper curl and blacken, though the thread it carried lingered long after the flames had consumed it entirely. Whoever had sent it clearly knew more than they should, and Edmund understood, with a growing sense of dread, that finding Clara was no longer simply a matter of easing his own conscience. It had become a race against forces beyond his control, forces that could destroy what remained of his family's standing, whether or not he ever managed to bring his wife home. He stood at the window long after the fire had died down, staring out at the dark stretch of land beyond the estate, wondering, for the first time in his life, if all the power and privilege he had inherited would prove utterly useless in the face of the damage his own words had caused. The town of Millbrook smelled of wood smoke and river water when Clara first arrived, exhausted from days of travel, her borrowed horse sold at a quiet market 3 towns back for enough coin to last her through the coming weeks. She had chosen her new name carefully during the long hours on the road, settling on Rose Hartley, simple and unremarkable, the kind of name that belonged to no one of consequence and therefore drew no unwanted attention. She found lodging above a small bakery run by a widow named Agnes, who asked few questions and seemed grateful for the extra coin a quiet boarder provided. Clara, now Rose, told her only that she had come from the north seeking work after the death of her husband, a lie that came surprisingly easily. perhaps because in some strange way it did not feel entirely false. The woman she had been at Ashworth Manor had, in every sense that mattered, died the night Edmund spoke those words in front of the household staff. Finding work proved harder than she expected. A duchess's education had prepared her for managing households, organizing social affairs, and conversing pleasantly with nobility, none of which translated easily into skills a small town required. She spent her first days walking through Millbrook's narrow streets, observing the shops and stalls, trying to determine where a woman with no trade might find honest employment. It was outside a modest dress shop that she finally found her opportunity. The shop's owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Louisa Fenwick, stood in her doorway arguing with a customer over a poorly finished hem, her frustration evident in every clipped word. Clara, watching from a respectful distance, recognized the stitching flaw immediately, a skill she had developed years ago under her mother's patient instruction, long before her marriage had buried such simple pleasures beneath the weight of duchess duties. When the customer left in a huff, Clara approached carefully. "Forgive my forwardness," she said, "but I noticed the hem troubling you. I believe I know how it might be corrected." Louisa eyed her skeptically, taking in the plain but well-kept clothing, the careful posture that spoke of better days somewhere in her past. "And who exactly are you to know such things?" "Someone who has spent more hours with a needle than she ever expected to," Clara said, offering a small, honest smile. "I am looking for work, if you have need of skilled hands." Louisa studied her a moment longer before waving her inside with obvious reluctance. "Show me then. If your hands are as skilled as your tongue is confident, we may have something to discuss." Clara's repair was quick and precise, the kind of fine work that came from years of attention to detail, though she had learned such attention while embroidering handkerchiefs for a husband who never noticed the effort. Louisa examined the finished hem with visible surprise, running her fingers along the seam. "Well," she said finally, "it seems the fates have sent me exactly what I needed. Can you start tomorrow?" And so Rose Hartley became a seamstress, spending her days bent over fabric in the quiet corner of Louisa's shop, listening to the gentle chatter of customers who cared nothing for titles or family names, only for whether their gowns fit properly, and their stitching held through a season of wear. It was humble work, far removed from the grandeur of Ashworth Manor, but Clara found within it something she had not expected to feel again so soon after her flight into the unknown. She found peace. For the first time in years, her days belonged entirely to herself. No one commanded her presence at dinners she had no interest in attending. No one dismissed her opinions before she had finished speaking them. Louisa, gruff as she often was, respected skill and effort above all else, and within weeks, Clara had earned a genuine place within the small shop, trusted with increasingly delicate work, and even a few loyal customers who requested her stitching specifically. The evenings were harder. Alone in her small room above the bakery, Clara often found herself staring at the ceiling, thinking of the household she had left behind, wondering whether Edmund had noticed her absence beyond the inconvenience it likely caused him. She thought of Margaret, hoping her friend had not suffered too greatly for her part in the escape, and she thought, sometimes despite herself, of the man she had married, wondering what version of him existed beneath the coldness that had defined their marriage from nearly its first day. She pushed those thoughts away as often as she could. Dwelling on Ashworth Manor served no purpose now. She had chosen a new life, and dwelling on the one she had abandoned would only slow her progress toward building something better in its place. It was through her work at the dress shop that she met Henry Colton, a merchant who traded in fine cloth and often visited Louisa's shop to discuss orders and deliveries. He was perhaps 10 years older than Clara, broad-shouldered with kind eyes and an easy laugh that seemed to put everyone around him at ease. Unlike the nobility Clara had grown accustomed to during her marriage, Henry spoke plainly, without the careful maneuvering of court manners, and his interest in others seemed genuine rather than calculated. Their first real conversation happened by accident, when Henry arrived to deliver a shipment of silk just as Clara was finishing a particularly difficult piece of embroidery for a wealthy customer. He watched her work for a moment, clearly impressed. "That is remarkably fine stitching," he said. "Where did you learn such skill?" Clara's hands paused briefly over the fabric, old instincts warning her against revealing too much. "My mother taught me, long ago," she said simply, which was true enough without inviting further questions. Henry did not press for more, something Clara noticed and appreciated immediately. Too many people in her old life had asked questions only to judge the answers, weighing her worth against expectations she never fully understood. Henry seemed content simply to admire the work in front of him, offering genuine compliments without any hidden agenda she could detect. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew more frequent, first centered around fabric orders and shop business, then gradually expanding into easier, more personal territory. Henry told her about his travels along the trade routes, the towns he had visited, the interesting people he had met along winding roads that stretched far beyond Millbrook's quiet borders. Clara found herself listening eagerly, hungry for stories of a world she had never been permitted to explore during her sheltered upbringing and brief restrictive marriage. In turn, she offered careful, edited pieces of her own history, describing a difficult marriage without ever naming names or revealing details that might connect Rose Hartley to the missing Duchess of Ashworth. Henry listened with quiet sympathy, never pushing for information she seemed reluctant to share, offering instead a steady, understanding presence that Clara had not realized she desperately needed. "You deserve better than what you've described," he told her one evening, as they walked together along the riverbank after the shop had closed for the day. "Whoever failed to see your worth was a fool, and their loss is simply that, a loss." Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar and welcome. "You speak as though you know me well enough to judge. Perhaps I don't know every detail of your past," Henry admitted, "but I know how you carry yourself now. Careful, but not broken. Guarded, but still kind. That tells me more about your character than any story you might share." It was the kind of observation Edmund had never once offered in 2 years of marriage, and Clara found herself both moved and unsettled by how easily Henry's simple kindness affected her. She had spent so long believing herself invisible, unworthy of genuine attention, that his steady interest felt almost foreign, a language she had forgotten how to properly receive. Their friendship deepened slowly, built on shared meals after long working days, quiet walks through Millbrook's narrow streets, and conversations that stretched late into evenings neither of them seemed eager to end. Clara found herself laughing more easily than she had in years, her guarded posture gradually softening in Henry's steady, undemanding presence. Yet even as her new life took shape around her, offering comfort and possibility she had never expected to find, Clara remained careful. She kept her past locked away behind the name Rose Hartley, sharing only what felt safe, always aware that somewhere beyond Millbrook's quiet borders, a search likely continued for the vanished Duchess of Ashworth. She did not yet know how close that search had already come, nor did she know that ambitious eyes beyond her husband's reach had also begun to take interest in her disappearance, eyes that cared nothing for her happiness, and everything for the leverage her story might provide. For now, in the quiet corner of a small dress shop, surrounded by fabric and thread and the easy company of a man who saw her plainly for who she was rather than what she represented, Clara allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine a future entirely her own. It was a fragile hope, built on a foundation of secrets and careful lies, but it was hope nonetheless, the first genuine hope she had allowed herself to feel in longer than she cared to remember. That fragile peace was tested one afternoon when a stranger arrived at Louisa's shop, a well-dressed man with the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. He introduced himself as a steward traveling on behalf of an unnamed employer, asking Louisa whether she had recently hired any new seamstresses, particularly a young woman of refined bearing who might have arrived in Millbrook within the past 2 months. Clara, bent over her work in the corner of the shop, felt her hands go still. She kept her eyes fixed on the fabric in front of her, forcing her breathing to remain steady, though every instinct screamed at her to flee through the back door before the stranger's gaze happened to fall upon her. Louisa, sharp as ever, glanced briefly toward Clara before answering smoothly, "I've hired no one of particular refinement, sir. Only local girls looking for honest work. You'll find little of interest here, I'm afraid." The steward's eyes swept the shop once, lingering a moment too long on the seamstress working quietly in the corner, her head bowed low over her stitching. Clara forced her hands to keep moving, the needle steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart, until finally the man nodded, apparently satisfied, and took his leave with a polite murmur of thanks. Only once his footsteps had faded down the street did Clara allow herself to breathe fully again. Louisa crossed the shop and stood beside her, her expression unreadable. "You needn't tell me anything you don't wish to share," Louisa said quietly, "but I've run this shop long enough to recognize when someone is running from something. That man was not asking after a common seamstress. He was searching for someone specific." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she set down her needle. "I cannot say more, Louisa, for your own safety as much as mine." Louisa studied her for a long moment, then simply nodded, returning to her own work without further questions. "Whatever you're running from," she said eventually, "I hope it never catches up to you. You've become a fine seamstress, and a better presence in this shop than I expected when you first walked through that door." The encounter left Clara shaken for days afterward, a constant awareness settling over her that the peace she had built in Millbrook remained fragile, vulnerable to discovery at any moment. She began varying her routes through town, avoiding the busier market streets where a stranger's eyes might more easily find her, and she asked Agnes, without offering explanation, to mention to no one that a boarder lived above the bakery should anyone come asking. Henry noticed the change in her almost immediately, her guarded posture returning in full force, her easy laughter growing rare again. He found her one evening sitting alone by the riverbank, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring out at the dark water without truly seeing it. "Something has frightened you," he said, settling beside her, without demanding an explanation, a gentleness in his manner that Clara had come to rely on more than she wanted to admit. "There was a man at the shop today," she said finally, choosing her words with careful precision, asking questions about a woman who might have recently arrived in town. "I believe he was searching for me." Henry's expression grew serious, though he did not press for the full truth behind her fear. "Whoever you're hiding from," he said, "they will not find you easily here, not while Louisa and Agnes and I stand between you and anyone who means you harm." "You don't even know what you'd be protecting me from," Clara said softly. "It could be something far worse than you imagine." "Perhaps," Henry acknowledged, "but I know you, Rose, or whatever name truly belongs to you beneath the one you've chosen for now. I know the kindness in you, the quiet strength you carry even when you believe no one is watching. Whatever drove you here, I doubt very much that you deserved it." His words settled over her like a warm blanket against the evening chill, and for a moment, Clara allowed herself to lean slightly against his shoulder, grateful for a presence that asked for nothing beyond honesty she was not yet ready to fully give. "There is more to my past than I've told you," she admitted quietly. "More than simply an unhappy marriage." "I imagined as much," Henry said. "But I am in no hurry, Rose. Whatever truth you carry, I will still be here whenever you feel ready to share it, or even if that day never comes at all." His patience, so unlike anything she had known within the walls of Ashworth Manor, moved her more deeply than she expected. She thought of Edmund's cold indifference, his impatience with anything that required emotional effort on his part, and the contrast between the two men settled something firmly within her, a growing certainty that whatever future she built for herself, it would not include returning to the life she had fled. Yet even as comfort grew between them, the shadow of the stranger's visit lingered at the edges of her thoughts, a reminder that her safety in Millbrook remained fragile, dependent on secrecy that could unravel at any careless moment. She did not yet know who had sent the steward searching, whether it was Edmund himself, still determined to reclaim what he had so carelessly discarded, or some other party entirely, drawn by rumors of scandal circling the Ashworth name. She only knew that the peace she had built, however genuine, however precious, remained balanced on uncertain ground, and that somewhere beyond Millbrook's quiet borders, forces she could not yet see continued moving closer, drawn by secrets she had hoped were buried far beyond anyone's reach. That night, Agnes found her sitting quietly at the small table in her rented room, a cup of untouched tea growing cold between her hands. The older woman said nothing at first, simply setting down a plate of fresh bread beside her before taking the seat across the table. "You've the look of someone carrying a heavy secret," Agnes said gently. "I've seen it before, in my own years. My husband, may he rest easy, once told me that secrets grow heavier the longer we carry them alone." Clara managed a faint smile. "I did not mean to bring trouble into your home, Agnes." "You've brought no trouble I didn't choose to accept," Agnes replied firmly. "You pay your rent, you keep to yourself, and you've never once given me reason for complaint. Whatever you're hiding from, girl, you're welcome under this roof for as long as you need it." The kindness in the older woman's words settled something unsteady within Clara's chest, a reminder that even in this uncertain new life, she had found people willing to offer shelter without demanding explanation. It was more than she had received in 2 years within the grand halls of Ashworth Manor, where every kindness had seemed to carry an unspoken price. She thought of Margaret, wondering if her old friend remained safe, wondering whether Edmund's search had grown more desperate or had begun, perhaps, to quietly fade. She thought of the stranger's visit to the shop, the careful way Louisa had protected her without fully understanding why, and she thought of Henry's steady patience, waiting for a truth she was not yet certain she could safely share. Millbrook had become, in the span of a few short months, something she had not expected to find again so soon after fleeing everything familiar. It had become, however fragile and uncertain, something close to home. But home, she was beginning to understand, could be taken away as easily as it had been given, and she resolved, sitting quietly in the gathering darkness, to guard this new life as fiercely as she had once guarded her own fading hope within the cold halls of Ashworth Manor. Lord Gareth Winslow's steward returned from his journey with news that made Gareth's careful patience finally pay off. The man had not confirmed the seamstress at Louisa Fenwick's shop was the missing Duchess, but his instincts, honed through years of quiet investigation, told him the woman's guarded posture and the shop owner's swift deflection meant something worth pursuing further. "You believe she's the one," Gareth said, leaning back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I cannot be certain, my lord," the steward admitted, "but the description matches closely enough, and the shop owner's reaction was telling. If I return with a portrait of the Duchess, I believe we could confirm it within days." Gareth considered this carefully. He had no particular interest in Clara's well-being, nor any genuine concern for the cruelty she had suffered within her marriage. What interested him was the leverage her location represented, a card he could play against Edmund at precisely the right moment, whether by exposing the scandal publicly to damage the Ashworth reputation, or by quietly informing Edmund of her whereabouts in exchange for concessions that would benefit Gareth's own ambitions regarding disputed trade routes between their two estates. "Return to Millbrook," Gareth instructed. "Confirm her identity beyond doubt. And Peters," he added as the steward turned to leave, "make certain no one else learns of this before I decide how best to use it." Meanwhile, at Ashworth Manor, Edmund had received a second unsigned letter, this one far less vague than the first, hinting directly that his wife's location had been discovered, and that certain parties intended to make use of that knowledge in ways that would prove deeply damaging to his family's standing, unless he agreed to terms that would soon be presented to him. Edmund read the letter with growing alarm, his earlier guilt now compounded by genuine fear of what exposure might mean, not only for his own reputation but for whatever remained of Clara's safety and dignity, should the full scandal become public. He understood, with sudden clarity, that finding her first was no longer simply a matter of easing his conscience. It had become urgent in a way he had not previously grasped. He summoned his most trusted man, a former soldier named Charles Gray who had served the Ashworth family for over a decade, and explained the situation as plainly as his pride allowed. "I need you to find her, Charles, quietly and quickly, before whoever sent these letters manages to use her against this family." Charles studied his employer carefully. He had witnessed enough of the household's tension over recent weeks to understand the full weight of what had happened, and though loyalty kept his opinions largely to himself, something in his expression suggested he held little sympathy for the circumstances that had driven the Duchess away in the first place. "I will search every town within 3 days' ride," Charles said finally, "but your grace should understand, if I find her, she may not wish to be found. Bringing her home may require more than simply locating her address." Edmund's jaw tightened. "I am aware of that. I intend to make amends, Charles, not simply drag her back by force. Whatever she chooses, once found, should be her decision. But I must find her before others do, for her safety as much as my own reputation." It was the first time in weeks that Edmund had spoken of Clara's safety before his own pride, and Charles noted the shift with quiet, cautious approval before setting out that same afternoon, following the trail of scattered clues gathered from earlier searches, market gossip, and the careful questioning of travelers who might have crossed paths with a woman fleeing alone. In Millbrook, Clara remained unaware of the two separate searches now converging toward her hiding place, one driven by calculated ambition, the other by a complicated mixture of guilt, fear, and something that Edmund himself had not yet fully named. Her days continued in their newfound rhythm, working alongside Louisa in the dress shop, sharing quiet evenings with Henry along the riverbank, slowly allowing herself to believe that the peace she had built might prove lasting after all. Henry's steward Peters returned to Millbrook within the week, this time carrying a small portrait of the Duchess of Ashworth that Gareth had obtained through a contact within the wider social circles both families moved through. He positioned himself carefully near the dress shop, watching from a discreet distance as customers came and went, until finally, late one afternoon, he caught a clear glimpse of the seamstress working near the window, her profile briefly illuminated by the fading sunlight. The resemblance was unmistakable. Peters returned to Gareth immediately, confirming what his instincts had already suggested. The woman calling herself Rose Hartley was, without doubt, the missing Duchess of Ashworth. Gareth received the news with satisfaction, already calculating his next move. He would not act rashly. Rushing forward with the information risked losing whatever advantage careful timing might provide. Instead, he composed a third letter, this one addressed directly to Edmund, far less vague than the previous two, making clear that he possessed knowledge of the Duchess's location and intended to use that knowledge to secure concessions regarding the disputed grazing lands along their shared border, concessions Edmund had long refused to grant despite years of Gareth's persistent requests. The letter arrived at Ashworth Manor just as Charles Gray departed on his own search, unaware that a rival steward had already confirmed what he himself had not yet managed to discover. Edmund read Gareth's demands with a mixture of fury and dread. He understood immediately the full scope of what was happening. Gareth intended to use Clara's location and the scandal of her flight as a weapon to extract concessions that would weaken Edmund's own holdings and strengthen Gareth's ambitions. Refusing meant risking public exposure of the entire humiliating affair, a scandal that would follow Clara for the rest of her life regardless of how the marriage itself eventually resolved. Agreeing meant surrendering land and influence his family had held for generations, bowing to a rival who had waited patiently for exactly this kind of opportunity. For the first time since Clara's disappearance, Edmund felt the full weight of consequences closing in around him, consequences born entirely from his own careless cruelty on a night he wished, more than anything, he could undo. He wrote back to Gareth immediately, refusing to agree to any terms until he could confirm the claims himself, buying what little time he could while privately increasing the urgency of Charles Grey's search. He could not allow Gareth to control the narrative, nor could he allow Clara to become a pawn in a dispute that had nothing to do with her own well-being. Charles arrived in Millbrook 2 days after Peters had already confirmed Clara's identity, following a trail of scattered clues that finally led him toward the same dress shop where the missing Duchess now worked quietly, unaware of how close both searches had drawn. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he watched from a careful distance, confirming what his instincts and gathered evidence suggested, before finally sending urgent word back to Edmund that the search had reached its end. The Duchess of Ashworth had been found, alive, safe, and entirely unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her hidden life in Millbrook. Edmund received the news with a complicated rush of relief and dread, understanding immediately that finding Clara had solved only part of the crisis threatening his family. Gareth still possessed knowledge that could destroy what little reputation remained, and Edmund understood, with sudden clarity, that confronting Clara now meant confronting not only his own failures as a husband, but the very real danger closing in from a rival who cared nothing for the human cost of his ambitions. While the two searches converged upon her without her knowledge, Clara's life in Millbrook had continued to deepen in ways she had not expected. Henry had begun speaking, carefully and without pressure, of a future that might include her more permanently, mentioning a small house near the edge of town that had recently come available, one with a garden large enough for the kind of quiet life he imagined they might build together. "I am not asking for an answer now," he told her one evening, as they walked slowly along the riverbank beneath a sky streaked with the last colors of sunset. "I only want you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever you're still hiding from, I would be glad to build something lasting with you, Rose, if you ever felt ready for that." Clara had listened to his words with a warmth that both comforted and unsettled her. She cared for Henry, genuinely and deeply, in a way that felt entirely different from the hollow arrangement of her marriage. Yet the name he used to address her, gentle and sincere as it was, remained a constant reminder that she had not yet told him the full truth of who she really was, nor the danger that truth might bring to his own quiet, uncomplicated life should it ever come to light. "There is something I must eventually tell you," she said quietly, staring out at the darkening water, "something that might change how you see me entirely." "Nothing could change how I see you," Henry said firmly. "Whatever burden you carry, Rose, I have watched you long enough to know the goodness beneath it. Nothing from your past could alter that." She wished, more than anything, that his confidence proved true, but a quiet fear lingered at the edges of her happiness, a suspicion that the peaceful life she had built remained far more fragile than either of them wanted to believe. Her fears were not unfounded. 2 days after that conversation, Louisa pulled her aside during a quiet moment in the shop, her expression unusually grave. "A man was here again this morning, while you were delivering an order," Louisa said. "Different from before. He asked pointed questions about how long you've worked here, whether you ever mentioned family, whether anyone visited you regularly. I told him little, but Clara—" She paused, using the name for the first time since Clara had confided her real identity weeks earlier during a moment of vulnerability neither had spoken of since. "I fear whoever is searching for you has drawn far closer than either of us realized." Clara's hands trembled as she set down the fabric she had been working with. "Did he give any indication who sent him?" "None," Louisa admitted, "but he carried himself like a man accustomed to serving someone of considerable means. Whoever he answers to, they are not searching idly." That night, Clara barely slept, turning over every possibility in her mind. If Edmund himself had finally located her, she was uncertain what that confrontation might bring, whether anger, indifference, or some attempt to force her return that she was fully prepared to resist. But the possibility of a stranger entirely unconnected to her husband, someone whose motives she could not guess, unsettled her even more deeply. She thought of Gareth Winslow, a name she vaguely remembered from Edmund's occasional complaints about disputed land along their shared border, though she had never given the rivalry much thought during her marriage, distracted as she had been by her own quiet unhappiness. She did not yet know that her instinct, however vague, had landed closer to the truth than she realized. The following morning, as Clara walked toward the dress shop through Millbrook's familiar streets, she noticed a man watching from across the road, his posture too still, too deliberate to belong to an ordinary passerby. She quickened her pace, ducking into a side alley she had discovered weeks earlier during one of her cautious explorations of the town, emerging on a parallel street that led back toward the bakery rather than the shop. By the time she reached her small room above Agnes's kitchen, her heart was pounding, and she understood with sudden, absolute clarity that the fragile peace she had built in Millbrook could no longer be trusted to last. Someone had found her, or was close enough to finding her, that the difference hardly mattered anymore. She spent the day in restless uncertainty, torn between fleeing immediately toward some new, unknown destination, or trusting that Louisa and Agnes and Henry would help her weather whatever storm approached. It was Henry who found her that evening, sensing immediately that something had shifted within her since their last conversation. "Tell me," he said simply, taking her hands in his own without hesitation. "Whatever it is, Rose, tell me now, before it grows any heavier between us." And so, finally, sitting together in the fading evening light, Clara told him everything. She told him of Ashworth Manor, of the cold marriage that had slowly hollowed her out from the inside, of the cruel words spoken in front of an entire household that had finally driven her to flee everything familiar. She told him her true name, watching his expression carefully, for any sign of the fear or judgment she had long anticipated. Henry listened in complete silence, his grip on her hands never loosening, and when she finally finished, tears gathering unbidden in her eyes, he pulled her gently into an embrace that held none of the calculated distance she had grown accustomed to within her marriage. "You are still the same woman I've come to care for," he said quietly. "A title does not change that, neither does a name." His acceptance eased something within her that had remained tightly wound since the night she fled Ashworth Manor, but even as comfort settled over her, she understood the danger had not passed. Whoever was searching for her, whether her husband himself or some rival seeking advantage from her misfortune, remained close, and the quiet life she had built in Millbrook now stood on the very edge of collapse. Edmund arrived in Millbrook on a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but had not yet released it. He had ridden hard for 2 days, stopping only when exhaustion forced him to rest, his mind turning constantly over what he might say when he finally stood before Clara again. He had rehearsed 100 different apologies during the long journey, discarding each one as inadequate the moment he tried to imagine speaking the words aloud. Charles Gray met him at the edge of town, having kept careful watch over Louisa's dress shop in the days since confirming Clara's identity. "She works there," Charles said, gesturing toward the modest storefront across the street. "Though I should warn you, Your Grace, she is not unaware that someone has been searching for her." The shop owner grew suspicious of recent inquiries. "If you approach carelessly, she may flee before you have the chance to speak at all." Edmund studied the shop for a long moment, his chest tightening with a nervousness he had rarely experienced in his life. He had commanded soldiers, negotiated with difficult tenants, faced down rivals in matters of business and land, yet nothing had prepared him for the prospect of standing before the wife he had wronged so completely, uncertain whether she would grant him even a moment to explain himself. "I will go alone," he said finally. "Whatever happens between us now, it should happen without an audience." He crossed the street slowly, his heart pounding harder with each step, and pushed open the door of the dress shop, a small bell above the frame announcing his arrival. Louisa looked up from her work at the counter, her expression shifting immediately from polite welcome to guarded wariness as she took in the fine quality of his clothing and the unmistakable bearing of nobility. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked carefully, positioning herself slightly between him and the back corner of the shop where Clara sat bent over her stitching, unaware yet of who had entered. "I am looking for someone," Edmund said quietly. "A woman who may be working here under a different name than the one she was born to." Clara's hands stilled instantly at the sound of his voice, recognition flooding through her before she had even turned to look. She had imagined this moment countless times during the quiet evenings since her flight, yet nothing had prepared her for the actual weight of hearing him speak again, close enough now that escape through the back door felt suddenly, impossibly difficult. She rose slowly and turned to face him, her expression carefully composed despite the storm of emotion rising within her chest. "Hello, Edmund," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Edmund took in the changes before him, the simple but well-fitted clothing so different from the fine gowns she had worn as Duchess, the quiet confidence in her posture that had rarely shown itself during their marriage, the calm, measured way she met his gaze without flinching or looking away. "You look well," he said finally, the words inadequate against everything he actually wanted to say. "I am well," Clara replied, "better than I have been and longer than I care to admit." Louisa, sensing the weight of the conversation unfolding, quietly excused herself to the back room, though she remained close enough to intervene should the situation require it. Clara appreciated the gesture without acknowledging it directly, keeping her focus entirely on the man standing before her. "I have been searching for you for weeks," Edmund said. "I feared for your safety, traveling alone with no protection." "I managed well enough," Clara said, a note of quiet pride entering her voice. "Better, in fact, than I managed within the walls of your household, where my safety seemed to matter little compared to your own comfort." Edmund flinched at the accusation, though he could not deny its truth. "I know what I said that night was cruel beyond forgiveness. I have thought of little else since discovering you gone. And yet here you stand," Clara said. "Not out of concern for my well-being alone, I imagine, but because my absence has become inconvenient in ways beyond the personal." Edmund hesitated, torn between honesty and the instinct to present himself in the best possible light. He chose honesty, understanding that anything less would only widen the distance already separating them. "There is danger beyond my own guilt," he admitted. "Lord Gareth Winslow has discovered your location and intends to use the scandal of your disappearance against our family, unless I agree to concessions regarding disputed land along our shared border." Clara's expression hardened slightly. "So even now, my situation becomes merely a matter of political leverage." "That is not why I came," Edmund said quickly. "I came because I could not bear the thought of you facing danger alone, whether from Gareth's ambitions or simply the uncertainty of a life built entirely without protection. But I will not pretend the danger from Gareth is not real, Clara. He intends to expose everything, publicly, in whatever way causes the most damage." "And what would you have me do?" Clara asked. "Return obediently to a marriage that offered me nothing but loneliness, simply to protect your family's reputation from a rival's ambition?" "No," Edmund said, and something in his voice, an earnestness Clara had rarely heard from him before, made her pause. "I would have you choose whatever path brings you genuine happiness, Clara. I came here understanding that I have no right to demand your return. I came only because I needed you to know the truth, and because whatever happens next, I could not bear for you to face it unprepared." Clara studied him carefully, searching for the calculation she had come to expect from him during their marriage, the careful maneuvering that always seemed to serve his own interests first. She found, instead, something closer to genuine vulnerability, an admission of fault that cost him visibly to speak aloud. "You expect me to believe you've changed," she said quietly. "After 2 years of silence, indifference, and finally cruelty spoken in front of an entire household." "I do not expect anything," Edmund said. "I only hope, however unlikely, that you might allow me the chance to prove it, in whatever way you deem necessary. Not through words alone, Clara. I understand words mean little after everything that has passed between us." The bell above the shop door chimed again, and both of them turned to find Henry entering, his expression immediately alert to the tension filling the small space. He crossed quickly to Clara's side, his protective instinct evident in the way he positioned himself slightly in front of her. "Is everything well, Rose?" he asked, though his eyes remained fixed warily on Edmund. Edmund's gaze shifted between them, understanding immediately the nature of the bond that had formed during Clara's time in Millbrook. Something tightened in his chest, an unfamiliar ache that he recognized, uncomfortably, as jealousy, though he had no right to claim such feelings after everything he had failed to offer her during their marriage. "This is my husband," Clara said quietly to Henry, watching his expression carefully. "Edmund Ashworth. He has come to speak with me." Henry's jaw tightened, but he did not step away from her side. "Then I imagine you have much to discuss. I will wait outside, Rose, should you need me." He left the shop reluctantly, casting one final glance back before the door closed behind him, and Clara turned back to Edmund, her expression unreadable. "He knows everything," she said. "My real name, my history, all of it. And he has never once looked at me the way you always did, as though I were an obligation rather than a person." Edmund absorbed this quietly, the weight of what he had lost settling over him with painful clarity. "I do not blame you for finding comfort elsewhere, Clara. I have no right to blame you for anything, given everything I failed to provide." "Then why come at all?" Clara asked, her voice finally cracking slightly beneath the composed surface she had maintained throughout the conversation. If you understand so fully what you've lost, why not simply let me remain here, safe and finally happy, rather than dragging me back into danger through Gareth's schemes? Because I could not live with myself, knowing you faced that danger without at least the choice of protection, should you want it, Edmund said. And because, selfishly, I could not bear the thought of losing you entirely, without at least attempting to show you the man I am trying, however imperfectly, to become. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken, until finally Clara spoke again, her voice quiet but resolute. I need time, Edmund. Time to decide what I want, free from pressure, free from Gareth's threats, free from whatever obligation you believe you owe me now that guilt has finally caught up with your conscience. You shall have whatever time you need, Edmund said. I will deal with Gareth myself, whatever it costs. You owe me nothing, Clara, not even consideration, but I intend to prove, through action rather than words, that I understand fully what I nearly destroyed. He left the shop soon after, stepping out into the gray afternoon where Henry waited with poorly concealed tension, the two men exchanging a brief, wordless acknowledgement before Edmund turned and walked away toward the inn where Charles Grey waited with news of Gareth's continued demands. Behind him, in the quiet dress shop, Clara sank slowly into her chair, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had finally passed, uncertain what the coming days might bring, but resolved, more firmly than ever, that whatever choice she ultimately made would be hers alone. At the inn, Charles Grey delivered fresh news the moment Edmund arrived. Another letter came. Your Grace, forwarded from the manor by Ryder. Lord Gareth grows impatient. He demands an answer within the week regarding the grazing lands, or he intends to bring the entire matter before the wider circles of society, including a full account of the words you spoke the night the Duchess fled. Edmund read the letter with a grim expression, understanding that whatever fragile progress he had made with Clara that afternoon meant little if Gareth succeeded in dragging her name through public scandal, regardless of her own wishes. I will not surrender the grazing lands simply to satisfy a man who cares nothing for the human cost of his ambition, Edmund said finally, but neither will I allow him to use Clara as a weapon while I search for some other solution. What do you propose, Your Grace? Edmund considered carefully, turning over the possibilities with a clarity that had eluded him during the anxious days immediately following Clara's disappearance. Gareth wants leverage against this family. If I remove the source of that leverage, by making the truth known on my own terms rather than his, he loses whatever advantage he believes he holds. You intend to admit the truth publicly yourself? I intend to control the narrative before he can twist it into something crueler than the truth actually is, Edmund said. I was cruel to my wife. I said words I deeply regret, and she left as a result. If society wishes to judge me for that honesty, so be it. But I will not allow Gareth to profit from a tragedy of my own making, nor will I allow Clara's name to be dragged through scandal invented for his benefit, rather than the truth as it actually occurred. Charles studied his employer with something like renewed respect. That is a considerable risk, Your Grace. Society rarely forgives a man so easily for cruelty toward his own wife. Then I will face whatever judgment comes, Edmund said. I have spent enough of my life protecting my pride at the expense of people who deserved better. I will not continue making that same mistake now that the cost has become so clear. He spent the following days composing a careful letter, not to Gareth, but to several prominent families within their shared social circle, admitting plainly to the cruelty that had driven his wife away, taking full responsibility without excuse or deflection, and stating clearly that any further attempt to use the situation for political leverage would be recognized publicly for exactly what it was, an attempt to profit from another family's private pain. The letters, once sent, could not be recalled, and Edmund understood he had gambled considerably on the hope that honesty, however damaging to his immediate reputation, would ultimately prove more resilient than whatever scandal Gareth intended to manufacture. Meanwhile, in Millbrook, Clara struggled with the weight of the choice now facing her. Henry found her the evening after Edmund's departure, sitting quietly in her small room above the bakery, staring at nothing in particular. He seemed sincere, Henry admitted reluctantly, settling into the chair across from her. Though I confess it pains me to say so. Sincerity is not the same as change, Clara said. I have watched him seem sincere before, in the early months of our marriage, before indifference settled over him like a second skin. Then what will you decide? Clara shook her head slowly. I do not know yet. Part of me wants nothing more than to remain here, in the life I have built with my own hands, away from titles and obligations that never once considered my own happiness. But another part of me wonders whether running forever is truly freedom, or simply another kind of hiding. Henry reached across the small table, taking her hand gently in his own. Whatever you decide, Rose, know that my feelings for you remain unchanged. I only want you to choose from a place of genuine desire, not fear of what returning might mean, nor obligation to a man who failed you so completely. And if I choose to stay here, with you, then I would consider myself fortunate beyond measure, Henry said simply. But I will not pretend that choice comes without its own risks, given what Lord Gareth apparently intends. Whatever path you take, Rose, danger may follow regardless of your decision. Clara absorbed this quietly, understanding the truth in his words. Whether she returned to Ashworth Manor or remained in Millbrook building a life with Henry, the scandal Gareth intended to unleash would likely reach her eventually, regardless of the choice she made. The only true freedom left to her, she realized, was choosing how she wished to face that scandal, whether from within a marriage she had once fled, or from a new life she had built entirely on her own terms. She spent that night turning the decision over endlessly, weighing every consideration, every memory of Ashworth Manor's cold, echoing halls against every moment of genuine warmth she had found within Millbrook's modest streets. By morning she had reached no final decision, but she understood, with growing clarity, that whatever choice she made would need to come from strength rather than fear, from her own genuine desire rather than obligation to anyone else's expectations. Word arrived 3 days later that Edmund's letters had reached their intended recipients, and that society's reaction, rather than the scandal Gareth had hoped to provoke, had instead turned largely toward sympathy for the Duchess, and quiet respect for a duke willing to admit his own failures so publicly. Gareth's planned leverage crumbled almost entirely, his threat of exposure rendered toothless now that Edmund had already claimed the narrative as his own. Clara received this news through a brief letter from Margaret, smuggled quietly through Charles Grey's careful arrangements, and she read it several times, trying to understand what it meant for the choice still weighing on her heart. Edmund had risked considerable humiliation, sacrificing his own reputation rather than allowing Gareth to use her disappearance as a weapon. It was, she realized slowly, the first genuinely selfless act she had witnessed from him in the entire span of their marriage. It did not erase the pain of everything that had come before, but it complicated, in ways she had not expected, the simple certainty she had carried since fleeing Ashworth Manor, that her husband's cruelty defined the whole of who he truly was. Gareth Winslow received the news of society's reaction with mounting fury, watching his carefully constructed leverage dissolve into nothing, as sympathy gathered around the very family he had hoped to damage. He summoned Peters to his study, demanding answers for how his plan had unraveled so completely. "The Duke admitted everything himself, my lord," Peters explained carefully. "Before you could bring the matter forward. Society now views his honesty favorably, and any attempt on your part to expose further details would appear as petty cruelty rather than justified scandal." Gareth's hands clenched into fists atop his desk. Years of patient waiting, undone by a single bold move he had not anticipated from a man he had always considered too proud for genuine humility. "Then we shall find another approach," he said finally. "The grazing lands remain disputed regardless of how this scandal has resolved. I will not abandon my claim simply because one particular strategy has failed." But even as he spoke the words, Gareth understood, with growing frustration, that his position had weakened considerably. Without the threat of scandal hanging over Edmund's family, he possessed far less leverage in the ongoing dispute than he had enjoyed only weeks before. Whatever came next would require patience of an entirely different kind, built on legitimate negotiation rather than the manipulation he had hoped to employ. In Millbrook, Clara continued weighing her decision with the careful deliberation the choice deserved. She spoke with Louisa, who offered practical wisdom born from her own difficult years building the dress shop from nothing after her husband's early death. She spoke with Agnes, whose kindness had never once wavered despite the danger Clara's presence had briefly brought to her doorstep. And she spoke, most often and most carefully, with Henry, whose patience remained steady even as the weight of uncertainty pressed against them both. "I keep returning to the same question," Clara admitted one evening, as they walked together along the familiar riverbank that had witnessed so many of their quiet conversations. "Not whether Edmund has changed, though perhaps he has, in some small measure, but whether returning to that life, even transformed, could ever feel like more than settling for what I once believed I deserved, rather than choosing what I actually want." "And what do you believe you actually want?" Henry asked gently. Clara considered the question seriously, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave to her finest embroidery work. "I want a life where my presence matters, where my voice carries weight, where I am seen fully, rather than tolerated as an obligation. Whether that life includes a title or not, seems, increasingly, beside the point." Henry nodded slowly, understanding the direction of her thoughts even before she fully articulated them herself. Then perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between two men, Rose, but in choosing the version of yourself you wish to become, regardless of which path leads there. His wisdom, offered without any attempt to sway her decision in his own favor, moved her deeply. She realized, in that moment, that whatever ultimate choice she made, Henry's genuine care for her well-being, rather than his own desires, represented exactly the kind of respect she had spent her entire marriage longing to receive. A letter arrived from Edmund 3 weeks after his initial visit, this one different in tone from anything he had previously written to her. Rather than pleading for her return or defending his own actions, the letter simply described the changes he had begun making at Ashworth Manor, small but genuine efforts that spoke of a man attempting real transformation rather than empty promises. He had established a fund for tenant families struggling through the difficult winter season, something Clara had suggested repeatedly during their marriage, without ever receiving serious consideration. He had begun attending to estate matters personally, rather than delegating everything to stewards, learning the names and circumstances of the people whose lives depended on his decisions. He had spoken with his mother at length, finally acknowledging the depth of his own failures rather than deflecting responsibility as he had always done before. The letter closed with words that lingered in Clara's mind, long after she finished reading. He wrote that he understood fully if she chose never to return, that he would honor whatever decision she made without complaint or further pressure, but that he wanted her to know, regardless of her choice, that her absence had taught him more about genuine partnership than her presence within their marriage ever had, precisely because he had finally been forced to confront everything he had taken for granted. Clara read the letter several times, feeling the weight of genuine change reflected in every carefully chosen word. It did not erase the pain of 2 years spent feeling invisible within her own marriage. It did not undo the humiliation of that final cruel night that had driven her to flee everything familiar. But it suggested, cautiously and without demanding anything in return, that perhaps the man capable of such transformation might genuinely deserve the chance to prove it further, should she choose to allow him that opportunity. She spent another week in careful deliberation before finally reaching her decision, one that surprised even herself in its clarity once she allowed herself to fully consider it. She would return to Ashworth Manor, not as the quiet, accommodating wife she had once been, but as a woman who understood her own worth completely, who would accept nothing less than genuine partnership and respect. And should Edmund fail to honor that transformation, she would not hesitate to leave again, this time without the uncertainty and fear that had accompanied her first flight into the unknown. She explained her decision to Henry with careful honesty, watching the pain flicker briefly across his features before he composed himself with the same quiet grace that had defined their entire friendship. "I understand," he said finally, "though I confess I had hoped for a different outcome." "You have given me something I did not know I was missing," Clara told him gently. "The knowledge that I deserve to be seen fully, respected completely, valued for who I truly am, rather than what I represent. Whatever happens now, Henry, I carry that knowledge with me, and I owe that gift entirely to you." "Then I am glad, at least, that our time together served some lasting purpose," Henry said, though the sadness in his voice remained evident despite his effort to mask it. "Promise me one thing, Rose, or Clara, whichever name truly belongs to you now. Promise me that if he fails you again, you will not hesitate to leave, and that you will remember Millbrook remains here, should you ever need refuge again." "I promise," Clara said, embracing him warmly, grateful beyond words for the kindness and patience he had shown her throughout her time in hiding. She said her farewells to Louisa and Agnes with genuine emotion, promising to write and to visit when circumstances allowed, grateful for the shelter and friendship both women had offered during the most uncertain period of her life. Louisa pressed a small parcel into her hands before she departed, a beautifully embroidered handkerchief bearing Clara's initials, a token of the skill she had developed and the friendship she had built within the walls of the small dress shop. Clara's return to Ashworth Manor differed entirely from her flight months before. She traveled openly this time, accompanied by Charles Gray, who had remained in Millbrook awaiting her decision, and she arrived at the estate gates with her head held high, no longer the uncertain young bride who had first crossed that threshold years before, nor the desperate, fleeing wife who had abandoned everything familiar in the dead of night. Edmund met her in the entrance hall, the same space where his cruel words had once driven her away, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had passed between them settling heavily in the silence. "Thank you for coming," Edmund said finally. "I have not come to resume the marriage we once had," Clara said clearly, her voice steady and unwavering. I have come to see whether we might build something entirely different, something built on genuine respect rather than obligation. If that proves impossible, Edmund, I will leave again, and this time, I will not look back." "I understand," Edmund said, and something in his expression suggested he truly did. The arrogance and indifference that had once defined him, replaced by a humility that felt, finally, genuine rather than performed. "I do not expect forgiveness simply because I have made a few changes during your absence. I only ask for the opportunity to continue proving, through consistent action, that I understand fully what I nearly lost." Clara studied him carefully, searching for any hint of the old coldness that had defined their marriage, finding instead a man who seemed genuinely humbled by everything that had transpired. "Then let us begin again," she said finally, "not as Duke and Duchess bound by family arrangement, but as two people choosing, deliberately and honestly, whether a genuine partnership between us remains possible." The months that followed tested that fragile new beginning repeatedly. Edmund's old habits occasionally resurfaced, moments of impatience or distraction that once would have gone unquestioned, but Clara refused to accept the silence and dismissal that had characterized their earlier marriage, speaking plainly whenever his behavior fell short of the partnership she demanded. To his credit, Edmund listened, adjusted, and continued the difficult work of genuine change rather than retreating into old patterns of avoidance. Lord Gareth Winslow eventually abandoned his claims to the disputed grazing lands entirely, recognizing that continued conflict offered him little advantage against a family that had weathered scandal and emerged, somehow, with its reputation largely intact. The rivalry between the two houses settled into an uneasy but stable truce, neither side gaining the decisive advantage either had once hoped for. Clara maintained her friendship with Louisa and Agnes through careful correspondence, and occasionally, with Edmund's full support, she traveled to Millbrook to visit them, finding comfort in the knowledge that the life she had built there, however temporary it had ultimately proven, remained a meaningful part of who she had become. She saw Henry only once more, a brief, warm reunion that closed the chapter of their friendship with genuine gratitude rather than lingering regret, both of them having found, in their own ways, paths toward the futures they truly wanted. Whether Clara's marriage to Edmund ultimately flourished into something genuinely happy, or merely settled into a respectful partnership built on hard-won understanding, remained a story that continued writing itself long after the scandal that had once threatened to destroy them both had faded into distant memory. What remained certain, regardless of how their future unfolded, was that Clara herself had changed permanently, transformed by her flight into the unknown into a woman who understood, completely and unshakably, her own worth. She would never again allow herself to become invisible within her own life, whether as Duchess, as seamstress, or as whatever role the future still held in store for her. That lesson, hard-earned through months of uncertainty and quiet courage, remained the truest inheritance of everything she had endured, far more valuable than any title or estate she had once believed defined her entire worth. Margaret wept openly when Clara returned to Ashworth Manor, embracing her former mistress with a warmth that spoke of genuine relief rather than mere formality. "I feared I would never see you again," Margaret admitted, wiping tears from her eyes. "And I feared even more that I had failed you somehow, by helping you leave that night." "You gave me exactly what I needed," Clara assured her. "Courage, and the means to find it. Whatever comes next for me here, Margaret, I will never forget what you risked to help me." The household staff, who had witnessed the humiliating scene that had driven Clara away months before, watched her return with cautious curiosity, uncertain what to expect from a duchess who had vanished so completely and returned with an entirely different bearing than the one she had carried before. Mrs. Whitfield, in particular, noticed the change immediately. The quiet uncertainty that had once defined Clara's presence replaced by a calm, unshakable confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. The true test of Edmund's transformation came several months into their renewed arrangement, during a dinner with visiting dignitaries whose opinions Edmund had once valued above almost everything else. An older gentleman, clearly unaware of the scandal that had briefly touched the Ashworth household, made a careless remark suggesting that women held little place in matters of estate management or political discussion. In the old days, Edmund would have laughed along politely, perhaps even added his own dismissive comment to maintain favor with an influential guest. Instead, he set down his glass deliberately and spoke with quiet firmness. "My wife has managed affairs during my absence, with more skill than most men I have known in similar circumstances. I would ask that you extend her the respect her judgment has earned." Clara, seated across the table, felt something settle warmly within her chest at his words, spoken not out of obligation or performance for an audience, but with genuine conviction. The gentleman, surprised but not offended, redirected the conversation with a polite nod, and the evening continued without further incident. Later that night, as they walked together through the gardens that had once felt so cold and unfamiliar to her, Clara mentioned the moment quietly. "You did not have to defend me tonight. It would have been easier to remain silent." "Easier, perhaps," Edmund acknowledged, "but I promised myself I would no longer choose ease over what is right, particularly when it concerns you. I spent 2 years choosing silence whenever it proved convenient, and that silence cost me nearly everything that mattered." Their conversations grew easier over the following months, filled with a genuine curiosity about each other that had been entirely absent during the early years of their marriage. Edmund began asking about her time in Millbrook, not out of jealousy or suspicion, but genuine interest in the woman she had become during her months away. Clara found herself sharing freely, describing Louisa's gruff kindness, Agnes's quiet generosity, the peaceful rhythm of a life built entirely through her own effort rather than inherited privilege. "I am glad you found that life," Edmund told her one evening, surprising her with the sincerity in his voice. "Even though it meant losing you, even temporarily, I am glad you discovered what you were truly capable of, away from everything I failed to offer you here." It was not a perfect reconciliation, nor did either of them pretend it could be. There were difficult evenings when old patterns threatened to resurface, moments when Edmund's inherited pride clashed against Clara's newfound insistence on being heard fully, rather than merely tolerated. But each time, they returned to the conversation, working through disagreements with a patience neither had shown during their earlier marriage, building slowly towards something neither had believed possible in the darkest days following Clara's flight. A year after her return, Clara stood once again in the entrance hall where Edmund's cruel words had once driven her into the unknown, though the space felt entirely different now, filled with warmth rather than cold formality. She thought back to the frightened, uncertain woman who had fled through the servants' passage that night, uncertain of everything except her own refusal to remain invisible any longer. That woman had found her way to Millbrook, discovered her own strength through honest work and genuine friendship, and returned not out of weakness or obligation, but through deliberate choice, understanding fully the risks and rewards of whatever future she chose to build. Whatever challenges still awaited her and Edmund in the years ahead, Clara faced them now as an equal partner, rather than a quiet, overlooked presence within someone else's grand design. She had left as a woman told she was unwanted, and she had returned as a woman who understood, completely and without doubt, exactly what she was worth. 2 years after Clara's return to Ashworth Manor, the estate looked and felt like an entirely different place than the cold, echoing halls she had once fled in the dead of night. The change had not come suddenly, nor had it come without difficulty, but through countless small decisions made consistently over time, the household had transformed into something neither Clara nor Edmund had believed possible during the darkest days of their separation. Edmund had continued the tenant welfare fund Clara first suggested years before, expanding it into a program that provided real support during difficult harvests, medical emergencies, and unexpected hardships among the families who depended on the estate. He visited tenant homes personally now, something unheard of among neighboring landowners, learning names and circumstances that had once meant nothing to him beyond the rent they generated. Clara often joined him on these visits, her presence welcomed by families who remembered her kindness, even during the years when she herself had felt invisible within her own household. Their partnership had grown into something neither duty nor obligation could have produced alone. Clara managed significant portions of the estate's charitable efforts, her voice carrying real weight in decisions that once would have been made entirely without her input. Edmund consulted her regularly on matters of tenant welfare, financial planning, and even occasional disputes with neighboring landowners, valuing her perspective in ways that would have seemed impossible to the man he had been before her flight. Lord Gareth Winslow, having abandoned his claims to the disputed grazing lands entirely, eventually approached Edmund with an unexpected proposal for genuine cooperation regarding shared water rights along their estate's common border. Edmund, remembering the painful lesson of how quickly rivalry could be exploited when built on genuine grievance, agreed to negotiate in good faith, and the two families settled into a cautious but functional working relationship that benefited both estates considerably more than years of petty conflict ever had. Clara maintained her correspondence with Millbrook faithfully, writing regularly to Louisa and Agnes, sharing news of the estate's changes and asking after their own lives with genuine interest. She visited twice yearly, always accompanied now by Edmund, who had grown to appreciate the quiet town that had sheltered his wife during her months of uncertain freedom. Louisa's dress shop had expanded modestly, employing 2 additional seamstresses to meet growing demand, and she greeted Clara's visits with the same gruff affection that had defined their friendship from its earliest days. Henry had married within the following year, a kind woman from a neighboring town who shared his easy warmth and genuine interest in others. Clara felt genuine happiness upon learning the news, grateful that his own path toward contentment had unfolded so naturally after the complicated period they had shared together. When she visited Millbrook, they spoke easily now as old friends rather than former almost lovers. The awkwardness that might have lingered between them, replaced instead by mutual respect and quiet gratitude for what each had given the other during a difficult chapter of their lives. The birth of Clara and Edmund's first child, a daughter they named after Clara's own mother, marked perhaps the most significant milestone in their renewed marriage. Edmund's devotion to his daughter surprised even those who had witnessed his gradual transformation over the preceding years, his gruff exterior softening completely whenever he held the child, a warmth that Clara had never once witnessed during the earliest, coldest years of their union. "I want her to grow up understanding her own worth from the very beginning," Edmund told Clara one evening, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in her cradle. "Never doubting it, never having to leave everything familiar behind simply to discover it for herself." "Then we shall make certain she never needs to," Clara replied, taking his hand gently in her own. Their household staff, who had witnessed the painful scandal years before, now spoke of the Duke and Duchess with genuine admiration, rather than the cautious pity that had once characterized their whispered conversations. Mrs. Whitfield, still serving faithfully as housekeeper, often remarked to newer staff members that she had never expected to witness such complete transformation in a marriage once thought entirely lost to indifference and cruelty. Margaret remained close to Clara throughout the years, eventually marrying a local tradesman and settling within the village near the estate. Though she continued visiting the manor regularly, her friendship with Clara having grown far beyond the formal boundaries of mistress and servant into something closer to genuine sisterhood. Dowager Duchess Eleanor, who had witnessed her son's darkest failures and his subsequent redemption with equal clarity, often remarked with quiet satisfaction that she had rarely seen a marriage rebuilt so thoroughly from such devastating beginnings. She doted openly on her granddaughter, finding in the child's arrival a symbol of the genuine hope that had emerged from what once seemed an irreparable family crisis. Not every difficulty vanished entirely. Edmund's old instincts occasionally resurfaced during moments of stress, particularly during difficult negotiations or unexpected setbacks affecting the estate's finances. But where he once would have retreated into cold silence or careless cruelty, he now recognized these moments for what they were, old patterns threatening to reassert themselves, and he worked consciously to address them before they caused genuine harm. Clara, for her part, remained vigilant in a different way, never again allowing herself to shrink into silence when something troubled her, speaking plainly and honestly even when doing so proved uncomfortable. Their disagreements, when they occurred, no longer festered into resentment or cold distance, but were addressed directly, resolved through genuine conversation rather than avoidance. 5 years after the night Edmund's cruel words had driven Clara from everything familiar, the estate hosted a grand celebration marking the anniversary of their renewed marriage, an event neither of them could have imagined attending together during the darkest days of their original separation. Guests who remembered the old scandal whispered admiringly now of the transformation they had witnessed, a duke who had rebuilt his marriage through genuine humility, and a duchess who had discovered her own strength through hardship and returned not diminished, but entirely transformed. Clara stood in the same entrance hall where everything had once fallen apart, watching her daughter play happily nearby, while Edmund spoke warmly with arriving guests, and she felt, for the first time completely and without reservation, that the life she had built belonged entirely to her, chosen deliberately rather than simply endured out of duty or fear. She thought sometimes of the frightened young woman who had fled through the servants' passage that cold night years before, uncertain of everything except her own refusal to remain invisible any longer. That woman had found her way through uncertainty and danger to discover genuine strength within herself, and though her path had eventually led her back to Ashworth Manor, she understood now that the journey itself had mattered more than the destination. She had not returned because she needed Edmund to complete her life. She had returned because, after discovering her own worth entirely independent of any title or marriage, she had chosen deliberately to build something genuine, with a man who had proven, through years of consistent action rather than empty words, that he understood fully what he had once nearly destroyed. Whatever challenges the future still held, Clara faced them now not as a woman waiting to be seen, but as one who had already claimed, fully and permanently, the right to be heard, valued, and respected in every corner of her own life. That certainty, hard won through months of fear and quiet courage, remained the truest legacy of everything she had endured, a lesson she intended to pass on to her own daughter, and one she carried with unshakable confidence through every year that followed. Years later, when her daughter grew old enough to understand the story of her parents' difficult beginning, Clara chose to share it honestly, rather than softening the truth into something more comfortable. She wanted her daughter to understand that even the people we love most can fail us deeply, and that recovering from such failure often requires courage that feels impossible until the moment it becomes absolutely necessary. "I did not leave because I stopped caring," Clara explained one quiet evening, her daughter curled beside her near the fireplace that had once burned cold and unused during her loneliest years within the manor. "I left because I finally understood that caring for someone else could not come at the expense of caring for myself as well." Her daughter listened with the serious attention children sometimes bring to stories that matter deeply, absorbing lessons that would shape her own understanding of self-worth long before she fully grasped the complexity of adult relationships and the compromises they sometimes required. Edmund, too, spoke openly with his daughter as she grew, never hiding the mistakes of his younger self, using his own failures as a lesson in the importance of humility and genuine change. He wanted her to understand that strength was not measured by never failing, but by the willingness to acknowledge failure honestly and work consistently toward becoming better. The estate itself flourished under their combined stewardship, tenant families thriving under policies that Clara had first championed, and Edmund had eventually embraced fully as his own genuine conviction, rather than simply his wife's influence. Neighboring landowners, who had once viewed the Ashworth scandal with quiet judgment, now looked to their example as a model of how genuine partnership between husband and wife could strengthen, rather than complicate, the management of great estates. Clara occasionally received word from Millbrook of Louisa's continued success, the dress shop having become known throughout the region for its quality craftsmanship, a reputation built partly on skills Clara herself had helped refine during her months working quietly in its corner. She took genuine pride in that legacy, knowing that even the most difficult chapter of her life had left something lasting and positive behind for the people who had sheltered her during her greatest need. As the years continued to unfold, Clara found herself reflecting less often on the painful night that had once driven her away, and more often on everything that difficult journey had ultimately taught her. She had learned that courage sometimes meant leaving everything familiar behind, and that genuine strength sometimes meant choosing, deliberately and without fear, to return and rebuild rather than simply running forever from what had once caused her pain. Her story, whispered still among those who remembered the scandal of the vanishing Duchess, had become in time something entirely different from the tale of humiliation and flight it once represented. It had become instead a story of quiet transformation, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal into something stronger, provided both people involved remained willing to do the difficult, ongoing work that genuine change always demanded. And so Clara lived, fully seen at last, fully valued, in the very halls where she had once felt completely invisible, having proven to herself and to everyone who witnessed her journey that a woman's worth was never truly decided by another person's cruelty, but by her own unwavering refusal to accept anything less than she deserved.